In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
It is 100% real. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Dimension. Today, we're up to episode 33, and we are diving into the realms of consciousness, quantum realities, and the holographic nature of the universe with a truly fascinating guest. Joining us today is Matthew Pallamary, a visionary author of The Holographicosmic Man. This is a groundbreaking exploration of the intersection between ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science. So this work is an amalgam of quantum physics, mathematics, geometry, brain structure, shamanism, neuroscience, and much, much more. It's a truly fascinating book. Matthew's written up to 21 books, and his work challenges our perception of reality and offers a deeper understanding of how we all are interconnected through a cosmic web of energy and consciousness. Whether you're a seeker of universal truths or simply curious about the mysteries of existence, you won't want to miss this conversation, so buckle up and get ready to expand your mind as we journey into the holographic cosmos. Without further ado, here's Matthew Pallamary. All right, Matthew, we are rocking and rolling. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great.
Today, I want to talk to you about the work you've done. You've written, over 20 books? Is it up to 21 now?
Yeah, 24th one just came out in November.
All right, awesome. So some of the things that you have written on is one of the reasons I started this podcast. One of the main topics I wanted to dive into was sacred geometry. And there's two of your books that I kind of isolated that I want to talk to you about tonight. One is Holographicosmic Man, the Holographic Heart of the Golden Mean. And then the other one I wanted to talk about is the Infinity Zone. So maybe we can talk about the Holographic Cosmic Man first, because in this book, you go into mathematics, sacred geometry, brain structure, neuroscience, archaeoastronomy, all these amazing topics that are right up my alley and what I love talking about.
Hey guys, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for tuning in. If you're enjoying this episode and want to help us uncover more mysteries of the universe, don't forget to support Curious Dimension. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit the like button. It really helps get this content in front of more people who are curious just like you. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to click that notification bell too, so you're the first to know when we release new content. For those of you listening on your favorite podcast platform, make sure to follow or subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and review. It helps more than you know. And whether you're watching or listening, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below or send me a message. Thanks for being part of the Curious Dimension community. Your support keeps this journey going.
So can you kind of give us a little bit of information about Holographic Cosmic Man? How did you come up with these ideas? And then maybe we can go into Infinity Zone after that.
Sure. So for starters, I might have invented a new word. I don't know. But Holographic Cosmic Man is based on a play on words, so to speak. And it comes out of the temple of Anthropocosmic Man, which is in Luxor in Egypt. And it's a very precise mathematical map of the human body. Everything is precise. I mean, even the doorways, all the artwork is full of, everywhere you look in that thing, no matter where you look, is the golden mean. The whole temple is laid out that way. So I found that fascinating. And the fact that the golden mean is prevalent throughout the human body was another fascinating thing for me anyway. So then when I started digging into it more, and I got fascinated more and more with sacred geometry. And I've always been fascinated with holograms. And I started to make the connections. My brain just went off. My brain goes crazy. Part of being a writer. So it went off. And we'll talk about a little bit this later, but it grew out of the Infinity Zone. And I always like to say that Holographic Cosmic Man is the Infinity Zone on steroids. And I'll just add a little caveat here. I've been working with visionary plants for years, psychedelics for years. I've been going into the Amazon for 25 years now, doing extended shamanic plant diets with ayahuasca and a bunch of other plants. It's a prehistoric tradition. And I always like to say But I learned everything I know about sacred geometry from ayahuasca and the visionary experiences. Then I read a whole bunch of books and followed up on it and did the background work later. But I got into it that way. And I have a really good friend, Professor Scott Olson. He's a professor of comparative religion.
Mm.
He's a major sacred geometry freak, and he turned me on to a boatload of books. And I got them all, and I read them all cover to cover, upside down, backwards, and sideways.
What are some of those books that he turned you on to? Do you remember some of them?
I can look them up here real quick because they're in the bibliography.
Did he recommend any of John Michel's work?
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with his work or not. I may be.
He did a lot of work in metrology and deciphering a lot of the measurements that were around ancient structures, Stonehenge.
Okay.
Yeah, but his last book that he wrote with Alan Brown right before John Michel passed away was How the World Was Made According to Sacred Geometry. And it was kind of his summative work
Wow.
around these topics. Yeah, he's...
Yeah. So for me, there's it's in terms of geometry, there's the Emerald Tablets of Thoth,
Mhm.
Dorial,
Yep.
and a lot about shamanism. A lot about cymatics. Are you familiar with cymatics and Hans Jenny?
Yes, I interviewed Jill Peirce, who one of her mentors was Hans Jenny, who I know was a student of Rudolf Steiner. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a Steiner freak. Put Steiner on the list.
Yeah. Yeah, I've gone through some of Steiner's work, and my wife actually used to work at a Waldorf school, and she was very interested in the philosophy they had there. He was clearly ahead of his time with certain things that are still around today. But could you tell me a little bit about Rudolf Steiner? What do you love about him, and why do you find him fascinating?
Well, he was a major influence, and the guy that I co-wrote when I wrote The Infinity Zone, I wrote 95% of it, and the guy I wrote it with, Paul Maybury, he'll tell you that, but he paid me to write it as we went. So, energetically speaking, it was a good collaboration. And he said once he saw what I was doing, he got out of my way.
Mm.
Well, so he's a product of the Waldorf schools, and the Waldorf people in San Diego heavily endorsed the book. They really loved it, and actually went on and it got International Book Awards, first place in the International Book Awards, and it was also bought up and published in Italian.
And we should probably say, like I said this earlier, you've written, over 20 books, but a lot of your work has received a lot of recognition from a lot of major players within these spaces. So I just want to say that real quick as you move on.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, I'm also a huge fan of a lot of Jung and Uspensky. Are you familiar with Gurdjieff at all?
No, I'm not.
So Gurdjieff is considered a Russian mystic, although he was Turkish and Armenian, and he was a seeker of truth. And actually, Jung was a protege to him in his later years, and he traveled the world seeking truth. He's been a major influence. He was a big lecturer. He was born in something like 1895, and he died maybe 1950-ish. A major metaphysical force of nature. And his work, for me, dovetailed in with Steiner.
And Gurdjieff. I want to write this down so I don't forget it. Gurdjieff?
Oh yeah. Gordjieff.
Gurdjieff. Got it.
Yeah. The thing about Steiner to me is he was one of the first people, but he really integrated science and spirituality. He really just flowed them together so wonderfully. About theosophy, and I just ate that stuff up. A lot of that I read back in the 70s.
Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar with Madame Blavatsky.
I read all her stuff. Sure. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about her and how she fits into that narrative? Was she a student of Steiner, or did she have her own thing?
That's a good question. That I'm not sure, but she was definitely a leading theosophist, and they still have a big organization here in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And the Steiner people are deeply connected with that. I can't tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
her books go way, way back. So, like I said, it was probably the late 70s when I was reading those.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't give you an intelligent. I'd go research it if you wanted, but we'd be here all day.
Well, why don't we circle back around to Hans Jenny and cymatics? Because that's where we got dovetailed. That's where we kind of went off on this tangent. But yeah, so I am familiar with Hans Jenny's work, and I do know what cymatics is. So yes. So where were you going to go with that?
Well, so in shamanism, in the end, everything comes down to energy. Everything is energy and vibration, period. So even sacred geometry, they say that music is geometry and time,
Mm,
and sacred geometry is geometries are space. So there's sort of time and space, right?
mm-hmm.
So there's movement, and there's, I don't even want to say static because it's dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I love about cymatics in particular is you can take a frequency and run it through a plate at a particular frequency with, a fine powder on there, and you'll get a mandala-like pattern. If you increase the frequency, at some point, it will dissolve into chaos. And then if you continue to increase the frequency, it'll form into a more complex mandala pattern. So I have frequency as a more complex pattern. It's dynamic and it's moving.
Mm-hmm.
It's geometrically beautiful.
Mm. It's undeniable.
Yeah. So to me, you watch that and you get in. To me, it's my model for the evolution of consciousness.
Mm.
And to me, the fact of geometry and sacred geometry shows that ultimately everything is perfection.
Mm-hmm.
Order comes out of chaos, goes back to order, chaos, because you get to a point where, in terms of consciousness, you have so many things and you know so many things. Your mind can only hold so much,
Mm-hmm.
and you have your perception of reality, and it gets to a point where suddenly the information you can't contain that information anymore in that particular psychological model that you have.
Mm-hmm.
It has to break,
Mm-hmm.
and then it forms into something newer, more sophisticated, more complex. Many would say more beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
There's Plato thing: truth and beauty are synonymous, right?
Yes. Do you find that like symbology and sacred geometry, these are efficient ways of, deciphering vast amounts of information that can have like multiple different, that can be multifaceted, right? And so instead of using words which are clunky and sort of and hard, if you had a symbol, you could translate much more information in a single thing.
I couldn't have said that better. For me, sacred geometry, just geometry overall, for me, is a universal language. You don't have to, you can be Chinese, you can be, Mongolian, you can be African, you can be whatever you want from whatever place. You could be a little tribe in the Amazon somewhere, and you can recognize patterns. You can recognize proportion. You can recognize these things, and you don't need language. I agree. It's very densely contained
Mm-hmm.
in there. And in my humble opinion, by the way, everything I say is just in my universe. Doesn't have to be in anybody else's. I always like to qualify what I say with that. But okay, that's a caveat. But the whole idea of the golden mean in a hologram, okay, it's infinite in both directions. There's the external and there's internal and external. I know you know this, but if you take a hologram and you break it down into pieces, every piece contains the whole.
Mm-hmm.
And if
Well, why don't you explain to the audience about the golden mean and the golden ratio and how that kind of manifests itself everywhere we kind of see things, so the audience has some context.
Yeah, sure. So the golden mean is the golden cut, the golden mean, the divine proportion. It's 1.618 that they call phi, phi, and it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere in nature. It's everywhere in the human body. I love some of these examples. If you look at your finger, this first segment to the next segment is the golden mean. That segment to the next segment is the golden mean. That segment to the next segment, all the way up, is the golden mean. If you study the human face, you'll see the golden mean throughout all of the proportions. Your belly button is at the 1.618 in the length of the body. So the interesting thing about proportion is it doesn't matter if you're using feet, inches, millimeters,
It's pure
proportion
number.
is exactly proportion is proportion. So, and it's like, okay, suddenly you buy a new car, right? All right. I bought a new Prius. Well, then suddenly you're on the road and you look and you see Priuses are everywhere, right? Okay, not until you bought one, right? So sacred geometry is the same way because, the basis of the Fibonacci spiral is the golden mean. And it goes out and out and out, and it can go in and in and in. It's infinite in both directions. It just keeps going through permutation after permutation.
Mm-hmm.
So you see it, throughout nature and flowers, the way that generally, there are always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, the way a plant grows, it follows what they call phyllotaxis. So you have, the leaf, and then the next one, and the next one, and it grows in the pattern of a Fibonacci spiral, which gives it maximum sunlight for maximum growth.
Mm-hmm.
Pine cones, sunflowers, the seed patterns, the conch shells,
Mm-hmm.
I'll follow this magical spiral. And interesting, and through all my work and research, when you think about spiral, and from the center of that you can perceive, and it expands outward and outward and outward. And you think of the basis of the word spiral, which is spire.
Mm-hmm.
Then you think of the word inspire.
Mm.
I think if you go back to the Latin roots of it, it means to breathe in.
Ah.
But to be inspired, spiral to me is the essence of creation, generally
Mm-hmm.
speaking. Nothing's hard and fast. There's, exceptions, but generally speaking, it's the essence of creation. So you're in a spiral when you create, one thing leads to the next. And it always follows this same wonderfully magic pattern. To me, it's proof that all is perfection.
Yeah, it's hard to look at these sort of patterns as you go from the micro all the way out to the macro into the outer space. You see these patterns that are undeniably there, and it's hard to it's hard to look at all of that and say, well, there's not something going on here. There's not an order to things, and that may have something to do with the fact that we're here to perceive it, and because we're here to perceive it, that may be why we are able to see the patterns. So it may have something to do with consciousness, which I'm sure you're intimately knowledgeable about with some of your psychedelic experiences. Do you want to talk about that for a minute, and how you've come to sacred geometric probably epiphanies in some of your your expeditions with psychedelics?
Yeah, I was always fascinated with the colors and the patterns that you get. And I originally was doing, it was my third or fourth, they're 10-day shamanic plant diets, very restricted, with ayahuasca and all these other different plants. And I got really inspired into obsession initially. And I wrote a paper called A Theory of the Evolution of Consciousness,
Mm.
which was based on these things. And I published it, and it was well received. And then when I was approached by my collaborator, Paul Mayberry, the tennis coach, about the Infinity Zone, it just exploded.
Mm.
Suddenly there was a whole book there, that came out. Because in visionary experience, you get information downloaded, but it's not in quote unquote normal language.
Mm-hmm.
It's a multi-sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's the example I like to give is when you're awake, you're generally functioning logically, you're figuring things out, you're driving the car, you're doing math, you're working, you're doing all those things. When you go to sleep at night, okay, those are considered to be left brain.
Correct. Yeah. That goes to sleep.
Yeah, it goes to sleep. And guess what? Your right brain comes out to play. And you can be flying on a pink horse with purple polka dots, and you're flying through the air, and you're accepting that in that reality at that moment. Yeah, of course it's a pink horse, and of course I'm flying.
Mm-hmm.
You go through all these wild experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens with ayahuasca is your left brain is still awake and your right brain gets turned on.
Mm. So you're aware of you're aware of the trip that's happening, and
Yes.
you can think of it. So that part of your brain isn't corrupted.
Yes.
So you're
But
basically you're aware and you're going along for this ride.
yeah, and you're getting spoken to in a language that is very complex. It's emotional, it's conceptual, it's intuition, and it can be quite overwhelming because intuition in men is really superior. Logic is going to be this, this, this. You and I are having a conversation right now. I'm stringing words together one by one. You're taking each word as I say it, and then you're putting together in your mind when I'm telling you word by word by word, sentence by sentence by sentence. In those visionary states, you get all this stuff at once, including emotional stuff and all these other things that go on. Even you have, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of synesthesia, where
Yes.
your senses cross, right?
Hmm.
You hear all this stuff these days about psychedelic integration, and that's sort of a pet peeve of mine. I won't go off on a tangent with that, but
Okay.
think, think about psychedelic integration. It's that it's the left brain trying to figure out what just happened.
Hmm.
When you wake up from a dream, if you remember it, you're trying to remember it, and you're trying to put together what was that? Where was I? What did I just experience?
Hmm.
And then your left brain's making sense of it. Oh, okay. Well, that would, as much as it can. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. Sometimes it's total nonsense because it's just very dense communication.
Mm. I
So,
wanted to say, I don't mean to cut you off there, but I had a thought there, and
no,
I wanted to run this by you real quick before I lose it. Do you think it's easier to be in like the hypnagogic state where you're kind of like half asleep, half awake? If there was a way you could, while you're in that state, to sort of dictate what it is you're experiencing, feeling, and seeing, maybe that's the best way to pull that data out from that state. And then I often wonder, is that something like what Edgar Casey was doing? Was he able to just will himself into these states where, because he would lay on his back and he would have his secretary there and he would just be talking while he's in this state and someone else
oh,
is writing it down. So he might not even be fully aware what he's
yeah,
doing. So anyway, I wanted to get that out there. What do you think of that?
a bunch of things. You may have to rein me in, so feel free to rein me in if you have
Yeah,
to.
no, yeah. I want you to run wild with this one.
So I'm also have been a huge Edgar Casey freak from years ago. I met his son and his grandson. I used to go to the ARE seminars and all that. What you described is actually lucid dreaming. And the most profound experience of my life was a lucid dream I had in the jungle. I wrote about it. I want to stay on track here with where we're
Mhm.
at with this point of the discussion. But it's all about awareness. Now, in our culture, generally speaking, we separate states of consciousness. I'm sleeping, I'm waking, I'm dreaming, I'm hallucinating, I'm having a vision. In indigenous cultures, it's all the same, and they view it as a continuum. So a dreaming reality for them can have just as much reality as a quote unquote waking reality.
Mm.
So when you do these extended shamanic plant diets in the jungle, very restricted, like I said, different plants and ayahuasca, it turns into really a 10-day visionary experience and everything crosses over and sleeping and waking, it all just runs together.
Mm.
And your dreams influence your visions and your visions influence your dreams.
Mhm.
So to me, you can get to a state, and hypnagogic state is perfect in a way because that's the boundary between fully awakened, quote unquote, consciousness and a visionary state or a dreaming state. You're in between. So you have some conscious volition. So if you can wake up within a dream, and the most profound one I had, I woke up in there and I realized I could take full control. And I said, I'm not going to take control. I'm going to wait and see how this unfolds and stay awake.
Mhm.
And I really had a life changing experience in that way. So my attitude now, when I do this kind of work, the visionary work, is I open myself up and I go, what do you got for me? You know,
Yeah.
I'm past all the most part. I mean, there may be some hidden stuff, but I'm past all my major trauma stuff and all that stuff. I've been at it with the ayahuasca and the plant diets here for 25 years. So,
Mhm.
and this is all tapping into the subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And the subconscious ultimately is infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So tap into that and it's speaking to you. I think if you think about how vast everything is, we are just dust in the wind. We're less than ants in the big picture. I mean, we're a microscopic mini nanoparticle, and yet we're a part of the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things I mean, I try to do this. I don't know if you ever do this, but, in that hypnagogic state, I always try to, like, when it's all over and I wake up for the day, I try to write down what I remember. And I find the more I do that, the more I do remember. At least I think I remember. And
No,
I think that's a good practice, and I've had friends that, know I'm into this sort of thing, and they've told me that they think they've received, like, information, almost like geometric patterns or landscapes and designs, and I always tell them, I was like, "Don't discount that." Like, if you start writing your dreams down, that may be a way for you to start to slow all this down. Like, they're getting it in flashes, right? It's coming to them in flashes, and that's one of these things that I've heard about with abductees in the UFO conversation is a lot of times they're shown like flashes of images really quick and it doesn't make any sense to them in that moment. But, you know, if it can be slowed down, then that information can be retrieved. And it may be later on down the line that that information is retrieved. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I mean, that's all fascinating information that comes out of the brain, which may or may not just be a receiver for information.
I think the information is so vast that we're tapping into something that we can barely comprehend,
Mhm.
And I think what you're talking about, I wrote down my dreams for years. I got to the point where I was filling like 7 pages every morning for 45 minutes. I finally stopped.
Really?
Oh yeah, I had notebooks. I mean, full. And dreaming is a big thing in the jungle because it does tie in with your visions and all these different plants that you work with. In the jungle, they say you're working with the spirit of the plants.
Mhm.
So all the different plants are different plant spirits, and they say that ayahuasca is the mother of all the other plants.
Mhm.
So to me, you can say spirit and you can say energy, and it's the same thing.
Mhm. So
So
ayahuasca gets a lot of like sort of play these days, and I don't know what it is really. I know it's a brew of sorts, but it's not one plant, isn't it? Like multiple different plants.
two,
There's two. So one
yeah,
is the psychedelic, and is the other one an inhibitor within the body that allows the psychedelic to take place?
yeah. Here's the deal: the one in the jungle they call chacruna, the Psychotria viridis. It's a bush, a leafy bush, and the leaves contain the DMT, which is psychoactive. You can eat the leaves all day,
And nothing will
and
happen.
nothing will happen because it gets digested before it can become orally active.
Mm.
When they mix it with the ayahuasca vine, Monastereopsis caapi, the vine,
Mhm.
it has MAO inhibitors that allow the DMT and the chacruna to become orally active.
Mm.
And it releases a lot of serotonin, so you have to be very careful. Anybody who does other things, especially if they're doing like antidepressants,
Mhm.
they can get serotonin overload and serotonin poisoning.
Ah.
They can go into convulsions and they can die. And it's not for everybody.
Yeah, and we should probably state that, that doing these things, it is not for everybody, right? Like, it's
Not at all.
there's
No,
there's
don't
definitely
try.
people out. Go ahead, why don't you say it?
Like I say, I got turned on through a mentor. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was in his 90s. But I got turned on, and he turned me on to some shamans in the jungle who have a lot of integrity. But this, to me, when I was doing it, hardly anybody even knew what it was.
Mhm.
I actually researched it for 10 years before I found it.
And how did you find it? Like, did you come across it or somebody tell you about it?
No, well, I've been researching it a lot in the UCSD library here in San Diego. And then, interestingly enough, I was writing a book about a guy who could go into the consciousness of animals. It was a novel.
Mhm.
And I was researching all these plants and all these experts, Richard Evans Schultes. I had stacks of research.
Mm.
And I was walking down the street like a couple weeks later, and I saw a head shop, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And I went in. I've gone on and off. Don't get me going on all the other stuff I've done, but I said, wow. And I went in, and there was High Times magazine, and I said, High Times magazine, that thing's still around. I haven't seen that since the 70s, right? And I picked it up and I opened it, and right where I opened it, there was an ad for ethnobotany seminars.
Mm.
And all the people I had been researching independently in the UCSD library were presenting.
Mm.
So I said, that's it. I got out the credit card and I started going. There was Terrence McKenna, if you ever heard of Terrence.
Yeah.
He was a friend. He got the first copy of my historical novel. Paul Stamets was there.
Oh, yeah.
Famous chemist, his wife, Anne. All the unusual suspects were there. And it was a week long. And so I went, my first one was 3 days in San Francisco in 96. And then 98, it was at the Maya ruins in Uxmal. And then 99, 2000, and 2001 was in the Maya ruins of Palenque.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a week long. And to be not only interested in visionary experience, but I've been fascinated with shamanism all this time.
Mm-hmm.
To have all this stuff there and all these people. So ethnobotany is man's relationship with plants. And theobotany is man's spiritual relationship with plants. So theo is the Latin root meaning God. And in essence, it's the God within the plant that brings out the God within you.
Mm-hmm.
So being a writer and studying shamanism, I took an honors course in anthropology about South American Indian religions, which spurred my first historical novel and all that. All these world-class experts were there for a week. And you got to hang out and talk to them and pick their brains.
And what year is this?
It started in 96. And then 98, 99, 2000, 2001. Those are the 4 I went to. And then when Terrence McKenna passed away, it kind of started to fall apart. It wasn't.
So he was really a beacon of light for a lot of this sort of thing we're talking about now. He had a masterful command over the English language from what I can see and find on the internet with interviews with him.
Yeah.
I imagine having a disagreement with him would have been a nightmare.
I don't know. It could be fun. So at the time when I first met him, my first short story collection came out, The Small Dark Room of the Soul. And I gifted him a copy. And he loved it. And he invited me to go spend some time with him. I didn't get to do it for different reasons. But when he was dying, his last thing was in Hawaii. It was the Alchemical Arts Conference. But my historical novel, Land Without Evil, had just come out. It was just coming out. And I had just had a meeting with my publisher and I got the first copy. So the absolute very first copy of Land Without Evil, I had my friend who was going to the Alchemical Arts Conference bring it and personally deliver it to Terrence. It may have been the last book he ever read. I'll never know.
Right.
But other people I know who were there were wondering what book he was reading because he was reading it the whole time he was there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And then 2 weeks later, I don't know if you ever heard of the Psychedelic Salon podcast.
I've heard of it, but I've never watched or listened to it.
No, Lorenzo started it, and I just met him in an ayahuasca ceremony. And he's like, I'm a writer. I'm like, yeah, I'm a writer too. Well, what did you write? And I pulled out the book, and he freaked out. He's like, that's the Terrence was reading. We wonder who wrote it, So that was a wonderful little synchronicity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I really wanted to ask you, I mean, there's 1,000 things I'd love to talk to you about, Matthew, but I would really love to get into your work with the Infinity Zone because, this is about, form and motion. And, I've, a big part of my life, a big part of who I am is in athletics. And, so I'm an avid surfer and wave rider, and I love the game of basketball. And I've always thought about the process of body mechanics and movement and style, how all these things are just aspects of functionality and parts of the brain that get lit up when everything comes together. Could you talk to us a little bit about this book and who you did this with, this tennis professional? Was it tennis coach? Sorry, Paul Mayberry. And how did this come about? How did you come up with this?
we met through a mutual lady friend, and Paul invented a device called the 8-board, and it looks like two turntables
Mm.
on a stand, and you stand on it with your feet, and you rotate back and forth.
Mm.
Body gets the figure 8 motion, and you combine that with the tennis racket, and you
Mm.
get the most powerful stroke you can get. That's
Mm.
power. Now, like same thing, only different. Like you, I studied martial arts. I'm also a percussionist and a vocalist.
Mhm.
Excuse me, in terms of martial arts and being a percussionist, body mechanics, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, I studied for years. I studied a drumming technique that was twice the speed with half the effort. It's how they characterized it. And it came on to me about the whole idea of the figure 8.
Mhm.
And a lot of this combining motion and geometry and physics came out of Rudolf Steiner.
Mhm.
So Paul was a student of the Waldorf Steiner schools and all that stuff. And as I mentioned, their organization here in Southern California loved the book. They endorsed it big time.
Mhm.
And as I studied it, just like the golden mean, I discovered that infinity figure 8 is everywhere in nature.
Mhm.
And the middle of the 8 is the maximum point of power. So like in a martial arts class, you start in a horse stance, and then you have your fist in. I'm doing this a little bit high, but you
Mhm.
start with that and you turn your hips,
Mhm.
then you turn your arm and you put your fist out. So from the ground up, you're doing a whole figure 8. And when you do
Ah,
it correctly, all that power is in your top 2 knuckles. It's like cracking a whip,
wow.
right? And when you come back, it's a figure 8.
Mm.
So then you look and you look at all kinds of other stuff. You look at a baseball pitcher, right? It's a figure 8. You look at
Mm.
a fly fisherman, right? Tennis. It goes on and on and on. You look at the most powerful force of movement is that figure 8. One of the examples I like to use, and it'd be a really thin figure 8, but I always like to use this example. If you look at you think of a pendulum, and when it swings up in one direction, you get to the point, at the highest point, it gets momentarily weightless,
Mm.
or it swings back the other way. So at the furthest end of its swing, what people might think that has the most power, it actually has no power. When you swing back to the middle, the maximum power is right in the middle.
Mm.
When you start to go the other way, you start to
Loses
lose,
power.
right? But the point is, it's in the middle.
Mm.
To me, it's fascinating that the center of the infinity symbol is the nexus of power.
Yeah, I would imagine it's the same thing in the act of surfing as well. As you come down into your bottom turn, there's a point at which you're fully loaded, and then you
Yep.
sort of release at the top of the wave and start to make that turn. So yeah, I can imagine this concept of the figure 8 manifests itself in multiple different physical pursuits.
Hummingbirds, they're
Their wings do that.
galloping horses, dogs, cheetahs. You watch, you study their movement. They're moving, their feet are moving in a figure 8.
And I'm
So
sure there's oh, go
go
ahead. I'm
ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 go ahead.
So, and I'm sure there's, you always see people that excel in athletics, and oftentimes people attribute this to, you know, physical abilities that are beyond. And a lot of times that is the case. But there are cases in other activities where, physicality, endurance, they're less necessary. And the mental aspect of it is more important in certain physical pursuits. Take jujitsu, for example. High level problem solving, and you have to be efficient with your movements and you have to strategize. A lot of that is mental. And if you have a good grasp of your own body mechanics and where to apply power at the right times, you can be a highly efficient grappler. It's the
Agree.
same thing. It's the same thing in surfing or wave riding. I've seen people that can do things on waves that they don't look athletically gifted in certain ways. They just look sort of like an average person. but they've figured out something in their mind and they know when, where, and how to apply pressure. And it probably has a lot to do with what you're writing about in the infinity zone. Um,
Yes.
their minds have figured out ways for their bodies to move at the right moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And the more you look, one of the things I found fascinating and I mentioned in the book is the first mission to the moon was Apollo 8, not the landing, but the first mission was Apollo 8.
Mm-hmm.
It is infinity.
Mm-hmm.
Reaching out to the path to the moon, and you go to the moon and you circle it and you come back, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's like one of those big cosmic secrets, like a lot of the sacred geometry is. The more you look, the more it's inherent in nature. The more you see it everywhere, and the more power. I mean, I'm also a hummingbird freak for a lot of reasons. They're the fastest. They have the biggest, in proportion to their size, they have the biggest hearts of any animal. Their brains, in proportion to their body, is the biggest.
Really?
Oh yeah, and they sort of defy physics, and their wings are all moving a figure eight. You
Just
know,
super efficient and quick.
yeah, a fish moving through the water, its tail, the figure eight.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the best. So when Paul had his 8 board, and we got into this discussion about the figure eight and infinity, and the download I got in the jungle with my theory of the evolution of consciousness, I put those all together
Mm.
and, ended up with the infinity zone.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, it's done really well. It got an international book, first place international book award, and then it was translated into Italian. And then after a few years, I thought, well, I wrote most of that book. I think I could do more with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was off doing Holographicosmic Man, and I brought in a lot of the stuff from ancient Egypt and other cultures that I had learned and incorporated. You know, the way the brain goes back and forth. Even the dialogue between the two sides of the brain is really like a tennis match,
Mm.
right? And you got the right conceptual, intuitional, visual in the left, and you're volleying back and forth across the net, right? Communicating.
Are you familiar with the telepathy tapes and Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell's work?
I'm familiar, but I haven't heard them or read them. I've had telepathic experiences through ayahuasca and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But in particular,
You would love, I mean, you would absolutely love it because, I mean, she identified this long ago that nonverbal autistic savants whose left brains are, in some cases not functioning, but their right brains are fully intact and firing. And, you know, nonverbal savants, they have the ability to spell and they have spelling boards and they're able to communicate. And the things that they have been communicating, it definitely appears to be telepathic abilities and psi abilities. It seems like they're reading the minds of their mothers and their school teachers, and people have just been reporting this for decades. And because of what Kai Dickinson's doing over there, producing this, more and more people are becoming aware of this. But it makes sense if that side of your brain is getting shards of information from something else. It makes sense that something else might be connected to everybody. And so these nonverbal savants might be able to just communicate that way. It may be an evolutionary part of being a human being. But for, neurotypical people like you and me, we're not exposed to it all the time because our left brain is constantly keeping us alive and, we're processing language and keeping us on the straight and narrow. But it's a fascinating idea and podcast. Excuse me, losing my voice.
no, it's okay. I have a theory / observation about telepathy
Tell me.
that it started from ayahuasca. So originally, I was in electronics in the Air Force, and electronics is the study of energy when you get down to it. So there's the concept of resonance. When a radio station transmits at a particular frequency, and you tune your dial on your radio to that same frequency, you get the signal. And the music or the talk that's being transmitted is on that, riding that, called a carrier wave. It's riding on that. But when you're tuned in to what they're transmitting, you're in resonance. It's a resonant frequency. So I think that when you drink, in my personal experience, in your ayahuasca ceremony and you're drinking, you all tune in to this resonant frequency. And I've had wild visions. And the next day when I was going to talk about what I saw, the person across from me would start talking about what I saw.
Hmm.
And there are tons of other incidences. And since I've done that, it happens to be more and more during my everyday life. I can never predict it. You never know when it's going to happen. It's not like, ooh, I can read your mind, not like that. It's very sporadic, but it happens. And I think when you're resonant with somebody at that same frequency, whether you're under the influence of ayahuasca or not, that you're tuning in and you're getting that. And I think what you're talking about with the autistic people is that that's one ability that they have, that they're dialed in. In terms of an ayahuasca ceremony, you're communing with plants and animals and other things when you're in that visionary state. And what they say in the lore of the jungle is that if you're sort of having a voluntary possession by an animal, so to speak. And what they say is that you can see through the animal's perception and the animal can see through yours, and you're sharing that space and you're learning from each other.
Mm.
And those are some experiences I've had with hummingbird energy in the jungle. But it all comes down to being resonant. So when you're with somebody, you're married, right? Or you got a girlfriend?
Yeah, married.
Married, been married quite a while?
Yeah, 4 years.
4 years. I'll bet half the time, or a lot of the time, she's finishing your sentences or you're finishing hers. You get with somebody like that and you're close like that, and you become more, one of the same energetic,
Oh, yeah, it's
right?
obvious.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And boom, 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 boom. You think about her and suddenly the phone rings and there she is, right? I mean, those are the kind of things that happen. And I think
Mhm.
it's becoming increasingly in resonance. So this whole idea of sharing of frequencies and being in that same spot, you're going to pick up things. And I think those people have that ability. It's innate, part of the way that they're tuned.
It certainly appears that way. I know they're working on getting more funding to do more controlled, testing with this, but the evidence is overwhelming and very compelling. So I think if they do more research, it's just gonna hammer home what people are already sort of suspecting. But Matthew, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I I think we're gonna have to do this again sometime because there's a lot more we left on the plate there. Like I
Oh, yeah.
said, you have been a prolific writer. You have written a lot of stuff. I'm definitely gonna check out more of your stuff. Tell people where they can find you and what you got going on.
Yeah, sure. So my website's mattpallamary.com, MATTPALLA, Amazon Mary, ARY.com. I'm also all over Amazon. My publishing company is Mystic Ink Publishing. Um, I'm also a well-known writing teacher, have been for years, primarily with the Santa Barbara Writers Conference. I got mentored by Ray Bradbury and Charles Schulz, Charlie Brown Peanuts. A lot of those guys were my mentors. They took me under their wing. And I just want to mention briefly, while you're poking around there, one of my books is called The Center of the Universe is Right Between Your Eyes, but Home is Where the Heart Is. One of the longest book titles ever. All that little rap I just gave about resonance and all that stuff is that book is about that.
I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah. And I'm all over the map. I have 3 short story collections, historical novel, supernatural thrillers, a horror novel. I'm an obsessive fool.
Well, I'm going to put links to your website and all of your stuff in the description below. Again, Matthew, this was really awesome. I got to have you back on sometime, but for now, we're going to end it. I want to thank everybody
Yeah.
for coming on, checking it out, and see you next time.
Yeah. Good job, brother. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the show. I hope you guys are enjoying the content. If you're finding any value, please hit that subscribe button, that like button, and leave a comment. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps out the show.